The Bronze Age collapse. When the ancient world fell. Apart for centuries, the ancient world in the eastern Mediterranean looked, from a distance, like a stable order. Great palaces governed from fortified hills. Merchant ships crossed open water with copper, tin, and luxury goods. Diplomats exchanged letters, gifts, and marriages. Cities relied on trade routes that stretched farther than most people could travel in a lifetime. And then, within a relatively short span of time, much of that system stopped working. Major cities burned, palace governments vanished, trade networks contracted, writing disappeared in some regions, and populations reorganized into a different world. This wasn't one empire falling to another. It was something more unsettling. It was a collapse of interdependence and ancient network failure. To understand the Bronze Age collapse, we need to first locate the world that collapsed. We are in the eastern Mediterranean and the Near East, a connected zone that includes the Aegean world, in and around modern Greece, Anatolia, now largely Turkey, where the Hittite Empire held power, the Levant along the coasts of modern Syria, Lebanon, and Israel far, Palestine, Cyprus, a central hub for copper, and Egypt, a major state with influence extending into the Levant. The time period is the end of the Late Bronze Age, roughly around 1200 to 1100 BCE, with important differences from region to region. This era was defined by palace-centered states and long-distance trade. Power often concentrated in royal and administrative centers palaces that coordinated production, storage, distribution, and diplomacy. And because bronze required copper and tin was not locally abundant everywhere, the entire system depended on reliable access to materials that came from elsewhere. Bronze Age civilization in this region was not self-contained. It was a network. That's what makes the collapse so historically important. When a network fails, the cause is rarely just one thing. The evidence for the Bronze Age collapse is not a single document or one decisive battle. It's a pattern seen across many sites and many kinds of records. Archaeologists identify this period through destruction layers, burned buildings, collapsed walls, charred material, abandonment sites that shrink dramatically or are left behind, disruption of administration, palace economies, and writing systems disappearing. Shifts in settlement patterns, more small villages, fewer centralized cities, changes in material culture, different pottery styles, different weapons, different economic behaviors. In Anatolia, the Hittite imperial system breaks apart, and the capital Hattusa is destroyed and abandoned. In the Levant, major coastal cities that had been integrated into international trade are destroyed. Most famously Ugarit, a port city that left behind cuneiform records preserved by the very fires that consumed it. In the Aegean, Mycenaean palatial centers, the administrative heart of the Greek world at the time, are destroyed, and the administrative writing system known as Linear B disappears with them. In Egypt, the state survives, but inscriptions describe conflicts and instability on Egypt's frontiers, including encounters with groups later referred to as the Sea Peoples, a term that likely describes multiple groups rather than one unified nation. The key point is this: across an interconnected world of palaces and ports, something changed so profoundly that many of the old structures could not recover. To grasp why this collapse mattered, we need to understand what the Late Bronze Age system actually was. This world ran on three interlocking systems. 1. Palace administration. 2. Long-distance trade. 3. Diplomatic balance between major powers. Palace administration in many places, especially in the Aegean, palace governments were not just royal homes. They were administrative engines. They stored grain, managed craft production, distributed rations, organized labor, collected taxes or tribute, and coordinated military resources. These palaces were systems designed for coordination, but they were also rigid. If the palace falls, the system doesn't simply continue without it. The accounting disappears, redistribution stops, specialized production breaks down, and local communities adapt in new ways. Long-distance trade bronze is a technology of dependency. To produce bronze at scale, you need copper and tin. Copper was more available in the region. Cyprus was famously important for it. Tin was more difficult. It had to be obtained through extended trade connections. This meant that Bronze Age power was tied to reliable sea routes, stable ports, secure inland corridors, diplomatic agreements that reduced friction, and social systems capable of organizing storage and transport. Trade wasn't a luxury add-on. It was structural. Even when goods were prestige items, ornate weapons, jewelry, high-status materials, the trade networks that carried them were often the same networks that moved strategic materials. Diplomatic balance. The Late Bronze Age also appears to have been unusually diplomatic. Great powers maintained relationships, alliances, and rivalries that were, at least for stretches of time, predictable enough to allow commerce. In other words, the system depended on a kind of managed stability. So what happens when the stability fails? You don't just lose trade. You lose the ability to maintain the structures built on trade. And once that happens, a society can become vulnerable in ways it wasn't designed to handle. Despite the dramatic nature of the collapse, we do not have a single agreed-upon cause. Historians and archaeologists broadly agree on the pattern of disruption. They debate the mechanisms. Key unknowns include which factor was primary in each region, how tightly synchronized the collapses were, whether the collapse was fast everywhere or staggered in waves, the true identity and role of the so-called Sea Peoples, and why some societies survived in altered form while others vanished. This is not one story, it is multiple local stories inside a wider systemic shift, and that is precisely why it remains so compelling. Most mainstream interpretations fall into two broad categories. Debate 1. Single cause versus systems collapse. One approach looks for a dominant driver climate, invasion or earthquake, for example. The other approach treats the Bronze Age collapse as a systems failure, multiple stressors interacting inside a tightly coupled network. In systems terms, this second view argues that the Late Bronze Age was efficient, interconnected, and highly specialized yet fragile. When shocks came, resilience was limited. Debate 2. Climate and drought significance. Some evidence points to periods of drought and climate stress in parts of the region, which would have reduced agricultural yields. In a world where palace economies depended on surplus grain to support specialized labor, any significant decline in food security would matter. But scholars also caution against oversimplifying climate into destiny. Even if drought occurred, it doesn't automatically explain why cities burned, why political authority collapsed, or why specific regions fell in different ways. Climate may be a pressure one stress multiplier among several. Debate 3. The Sea Peoples cause, symptom, or label. Egyptian sources describe conflicts with groups often grouped under the term Sea Peoples, but it is not clear whether this label refers to a single coalition, multiple groups acting independently, mixed forces including raiders, mercenaries, migrants, and displaced populations. In some interpretations, these groups are a major destabilizing force. In others, they are the visible edge of something deeper. Populations moving because the system was already failing. Debate 4. Earthquakes. Some researchers have proposed that earthquake activity could have contributed to destruction and instability in certain areas. It is plausible that seismic events damaged infrastructure and forced resource diversion. But many destruction layers also resemble warfare, not just structural collapse. Earthquakes might be part of the story, but it is rarely presented as a complete explanation on its own. One of the clearest ways to understand the Bronze Age collapse is to compare it to systems in other eras. Highly interconnected systems tend to produce efficiency, specialization, rapid growth, but they also tend to produce dependency, cascading failure when key links break, vulnerability to simultaneous stress. The Late Bronze Age world was a network of networks. When trade routes destabilize, when diplomatic balance fractures, when food security declines, when cities become less governable, when migrations accelerate, each factor can intensify the others. In that sense, the Bronze Age collapse is not unique because civilizations fell. Civilizations fall often. It is unique because the collapse appears to be regional, interdependent, and transformative. It isn't simply a replacement of rulers, it's a change in how the world was organized. So what likely happened? A careful answer sounds less dramatic than popular legend, but it is stronger. The Bronze Age collapse appears to be a period when multiple pressures converged. Pressure 1, disruption of trade and strategic materials. If trade routes were interrupted through conflict, piracy, diplomatic breakdown, or political instability, then bronze production would suffer. If bronze production suffers, military capability, tool-making, and elite power projection can suffer with it. In a palace-centered system, trade is not peripheral, it is a pillar. Pressure 2, political instability and internal breakdown. Centralized palace systems can be powerful, but they can also be brittle. If legitimacy weakens, or if elite competition rises, or if administrative capacity breaks down, local regions may stop cooperating with the center. Once that happens, the palace loses its core function coordination. And when coordination fails, states fragment. Pressure 3, migration, displacement, and conflict. In periods of instability, populations move. Some movements may have been raiding. Others may have been refugee migrations. Some groups may have been opportunistic, others desperate. Whatever the mix, large-scale movement into fragile regions can destabilize trade, agriculture, and governance. This is where groups like the Sea Peoples may fit not as a single cause, but as part of the wider motion of people through a failing system. Pressure 4, environmental stress as a multiplier. Drought does not have to be the sole cause to matter. In agrarian systems, food is stability. Reduced harvests can increase prices, strain legitimacy, weaken armies, and accelerate unrest. Even modest environmental stress can become dangerous when combined with political instability and trade disruption. The result? A cascade. Instead of one decisive event, think of the collapse as a sequence of cascading failures. Trade becomes unreliable, material shortages emerge, palatial administrations strain, conflict increases, cities become less governable, people move, economies contract, more states destabilize, more trade routes fail, and soon the entire interconnected system becomes something else. The important point is what comes next. After the collapse, many regions show signs of smaller, localized communities, less centralized administration, reduced international trade, new political identities forming over time. This is not the end of human civilization. It is a reorganization into a different kind of world. The Bronze Age collapse matters because it is one of history's clearest examples of a truth that still applies. Complex systems can fail in ways that are not intuitive. When societies are highly interconnected, they are capable of extraordinary achievements, but they can also be exposed to cascading failure. The collapse reminds us that trade networks create dependence, political legitimacy is an infrastructure, resilience is not the same as power, and when multiple stresses arrive together, stability can fracture faster than any single cause would suggest. For a channel called Origins of Order, this topic is central because the collapse is not only about what fell, it's about how order was rebuilt afterward, often in new forms, under new conditions with new assumptions. History does not only record progress, it records adaptation. The Bronze Age world was not primitive. It was coordinated, connected, and sophisticated in ways that are easy to underestimate. And that is why its collapse still unsettles us, because it suggests that civilization is not merely a ladder you climb, it is a structure you maintain. And when the links that hold it together begin to break trade, legitimacy, food, security collapse is not always a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it is the slow realization that the world you depended on is no longer returning. In the next episode, we can follow one thread of this collapse more closely, through a single city, a single coastline, or a single decision that changed the ancient world.